Be still. Be still and know that I am God. Cease striving. Right across the Western world, that is the message. Be still and know that I am God. Know it in the depth of your soul. Now, tonight and next Wednesday night, I want to paint a picture. I want to paint a huge picture, a beautiful picture. And all of you are going to be in the picture. And when I am done, I hope that you will see yourself as you have never seen yourself. I hope that you will see yourself for who you really are. I want you to see the staggering truth about your identity, about who you are and why you're here and why your life is so good and so full of glory and beauty. And at the same time, I hope you will come to understand why your life is also such a mess and why there is so much anxiety and turmoil and brokenness in your life. Now, before I launch into this big picture painting that I want to set before you, let me give you the brief version. And the brief version is this. There are two reasons that you are the way that you are. Two reasons that I'm the way that I am. The first reason is that you are the way that you are because God has always wanted to have a daughter like you. You are the way that you are because God has always wanted to have a son like you. That is why you exist. That is why you've been created. That is why you're here. And that is why your life is so full of glory and life and goodness. Before the creation of the world, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit thought of you by name, by person, and set out a plan whereby you could be drawn into the life that they share together. The second reason you are the way that you are is because you do not know who you are. We have been deceived, and we don't know who we are. And because we don't know who we are, we keep trying to recreate ourselves. And our recreations are disasters. They don't work. Our recreations poison our relationships. Our recreations poison our friendships and our community. They poison our work and our play. Because we don't know who we are, we try to recreate ourselves, and our recreations short-circuit our life. In fact, what they do is they keep you from being you. Now, we're going to work all of this out as best we can in the time that we have. But before we do that, we need to have the big picture in front of us. Now, the way I'm going to tackle the big picture is I want to address a specific question. And that question is this: who is Jesus, and why did Jesus die? Who is Jesus and why did he die? That's the canvas. And as I begin to work my way through answering that question, I will be painting. And as I'm painting, you're going to begin to see yourself for who you really are. So hang in there with me. 2,000 years ago, Jesus Christ died on the cross of Calvary. From the perspective of the Roman Empire, his death was just another incident of Roman rule, just another example of Roman brutality and law and order, just another execution. Now, from the perspective of the Jewish leadership, the death of Jesus was a moment of victory. They had successfully manipulated the Roman power structure to eliminate the greatest threat to their power and prestige, the carpenter and teacher from Nazareth. Now, from the perspective of the disciples of Jesus, the death of Jesus was a moment of the profoundest horror and grief. Their friend, their master, the one they believed in, the one they thought would save them and the world and usher in the kingdom of God, fell victim to the system. He hung on a cross like a criminal, an outcast. Everybody mocked him. The disciples did what you would have done and what I would have done. They ran for their lives. 3 days later, their tune began to change. 3 days later, they met Jesus again, risen from the grave. And in the light of the resurrection, the disciples looked back and saw something going on in the death of Jesus that was so huge and so vast and so deep that they couldn't even begin to get their minds around it. In the light of the resurrection of Jesus, they looked back and they saw that in this event of the death of Christ, that was in fact the moment of all moments in human history. They saw here in this one little moment on Calvary's Hill, they saw human history itself turn as on an axis. Here was the moment of all moments, the event of all events. In the light of the resurrection, they began to get a glimpse of the glory of Jesus. And they began to see that here in this one man, God had decisively and sovereignly altered the entire world. The New Testament is the record for us of their joy and of their attempt, their mammoth struggle to even begin to get to grips with how to explain who Jesus is and what happened. Now, 2,000 years later, we're still trying to understand. 2,000 years later, we're still asking the question, who is Jesus and what did he really do? And what does it mean for us now? And how can his death on a cross 2,000 years ago be of any benefit to anyone living in the year 2000? 2,000 years later, the church is coming right back around all over again to raise the question, who is Jesus and what did he do and what does it mean? What became of us in his life and death and resurrection? How can what happened to this man named Jesus be of any benefit to us in the year 2000, this far away from Jerusalem? Now, the death of Jesus Christ is part of a seamless movement that begins in eternity with the Father, Son, and Spirit and comes down, and that movement ends with the exaltation of the human race, us, back to the Father. The death of Jesus Christ is part of a seamless movement that comes down and gathers us together and takes us back to the right hand of the Father. If we are to understand why Jesus died and what happened in his death and what it means for us today, the first thing we've got to do is we've got to go all the way back to eternity. We've got to go all the way back to the beginning. We've got to go all the way back and talk about who God is. We have to go back and to the astonishing decision made in eternity by the Father, Son, and Spirit to include us in their circle of shared life. That's the context for the death of Jesus. And the reality that drives Jesus Christ to earth and the reality that pushes him to the cross is the love and the passion and the implacable passion and love of the Father for each one of us. That's why Jesus came. That's why he went to the cross, is because the Father wanted us there with him in heaven. And the only way to get us there was to go down into death and bring us forth into resurrection. The reason Jesus died is because the Father loves you with an everlasting, eternal, implacable, undauntable love that refuses, that absolutely refuses to allow you to perish. You parents know that love. You moms and dads in the room, you know that love for your children. That doesn't start with you, it starts with the Father in heaven. And that's a bare hint of the kind of love that he has for us. Now, the golden rule of interpretation is context. If we're dealing with a marital problem, or if we're dealing with a crisis at work or an international incident that rocks the whole world, if we're going to understand what happened and why, we have to understand the context. Now, the death of Jesus is doomed to misinterpretation unless we get inside the context, unless we get inside the things that made it necessary. Let me repeat that. We will misinterpret the death of Christ every time until we go back and get it in its proper context. We've got to understand the issues and the dynamics that created the situation within which Jesus died. Let me boil it down to two things. Number one, the context for the death of Jesus Christ is the heart of God. And by the heart of God, I mean both God's purpose for all of us and the fire in his belly that purpose would be fulfilled no matter what it cost. That's the first thing to be said about context. The second thing to be said about the context of Jesus' death is what the Bible calls sin. The profound disease that infiltrated human existence in Adam and threatened God the Father's purpose for us and threatened his creation with destruction. Those two things come together to create the necessity within which Jesus Christ comes to earth and lives and dies. Now, I want to talk a moment about the fire in God's belly. Isn't that a good picture? You don't believe that, do you? You think God's got the hots for you? We got a lot to learn. We've been at it 2,000 years and we hadn't gotten the point yet. Before the creation of the world, the Father set his love upon you and he will never, ever take it back. Never. That's the truth. Now, let me talk about the heart of God. Now, to do that, let me go for a moment and say that the two things that distinguish the Christian doctrine of God, the Christian vision of God from every other religion in history, the two things that set apart the Christian vision of God from every other religion and every other bit of philosophy in history are, number one, the Trinity. Father, Son, and Spirit. Number two, the second thing that distinguishes the Christian vision of God from every other religion in history is the humility of God. The humility of God. In no other religion do we have a God who stoops. In no other religion do we have a God who plans to come down into our world and unite himself with us and share all that he is and has with us. And in no other religion do we have a God who will not only come to us, but who is prepared to suffer. Who is prepared to suffer to accomplish that purpose of sharing the life that he has with us. God does not want to be God without us, and never has, and never will. You believe that? From the foundation of the world, God has known you and named you and wanted to share all that he is and has with you. And part of what John means in his gospel when he begins by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, is just that. He's saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. John is saying it's always been the eternal Word of God to become flesh. That's God's eternal purpose. That's the thing that predates everything, creation and everything else. Now, behind this vision of God who stoops, a God who's humble, a God who wants to come to us and is prepared to suffer so that the dreams that he has for our benefit would be fulfilled. Behind this vision is the fact that God is Father, Son, and Spirit. The Bible says that the Father loves the Son, and that the Son loves the Father, and that they share all things together in the abounding fellowship of the Holy Spirit. Now think about this. Is there anything deeper about God than the mutual love of the Father, Son, and Spirit? If we get all the way down to that place in God, is there something yet underneath? Is there something underneath that really calls the shots with God? And what the Bible is trying to tell us, and the history of the church is trying to tell us, is that the deepest truth of the being of God is that mutual love of Father, Son, and Spirit. Everything to be said Everything to be said about God is a variation on that theme. The theme of fellowship, the theme of relationship, the theme of this love of the Father, Son, and Spirit. God's not a divine ogre, because the Father has loved the Son, and the Son has loved the Father in the fellowship of the Spirit from all eternity. That's who God is. His ogre business has come in from paganism. And we lost the Trinity long enough to let it come in, and it's killing all of us. But there's liberation on the horizon. Now, think this through. When we talk about the love of God, what are we talking about? We're trying to describe the relationship of the Father, Son, and Spirit. That's the love of God. When you talk about the holiness of God, what are we really talking about? We talk about the holiness of God, we're really trying to describe the rightness and the integrity and the purity and the beauty and the glory of that relationship, the Father, Son, and Spirit. That's the holiness of God. You talk about the righteousness of God. Righteousness means right relationship. We talk about the blessedness of God or the fullness of God. We're really talking about this relationship that exists between the Father, Son, and Spirit. And fellowship is not an attribute of God. Fellowship is not an attribute of God. It's not something that may or may not happen on a given day. God exists in fellowship. To believe in the Trinity means that we believe that God is a relational being and has always been a relational being and will always be a relational being. To believe in the Trinity means that relationship, now just think this through for a minute. It means that relationship, that fellowship, that togetherness and sharing, that self-giving and other-centeredness are not afterthoughts with God. Just want to write this down. To believe in the Trinity means that relationship is that working? Not very well, is it? How about this? How's that? Can you read that back there? I can hardly read that here. Well, you're going to learn that I can't spell. So that relationship, that fellowship, that togetherness, and self-giving and other-centeredness. Can you read that? My mother tells me I write poorly because I can't spell, and she's right. But thank the Lord for spell checkers on computers. Never made it through my dissertation without that. Now, when we talk about the Trinity, before we get overgone into abstractions and all this mumbo-jumbo about arithmetic, let's just think about this. What we're saying when we talk about the Trinity is that fellowship is not something that God has on occasion. That fellowship is at the essence of the being of God, that togetherness and that self-giving is not self-centered. Now see, if there's no Trinity and you just have God up there, then the reason God creates the world is for His benefit. See that? Creates us so that we'll do things for Him. The Trinity is the Father, Son, and Spirit relationship. The reason this God creates is to share the life that they have together with us so that we can be part of the family. God's not self-centered, other-centered. Self-giving love and fellowship are part of the very being of God. Now, when Christianity says God, it does not say self-centered. It does not say removed and distant and detached and indifferent and austere, and it doesn't say lonely or sad or bored. Years ago when I was in Scotland, I did a kind of a study for some kids in school, and they were all circled around the floor, and so I said, why did God create the world? And this one little boy's hand went just like this, and I called him, he said, because he was bored. Well, if God's by Himself and there's nothing there, He creates the world because He's bored and have something to do. That means that you and I are here for His benefit. That's not Christianity. That's paganism. Christianity is no God is Father, Son, and Spirit. They have a rich and overflowing and abounding life with or without us. They don't create for their benefit, but for ours, because God exists in that way. The Father lives for the Son, and the Son lives for the Father, and they share all things together in the Spirit. Not self-centered, other-centered. Now, the confession of the church historically has been that God is Father, Son, and Spirit. Now, what I want you to understand is that that relationship, I'm trying to make this a little bit bigger. How's that? That relationship of Father, Son, and Spirit is the womb of all things. Everything that God does begins there in that relationship and in that love. And before creation of the world, the Father, Son, and Spirit made the astonishing decision. They made the astonishing decision that they would open their life, open that circle of Father, Son, and Spirit, and share it with us. Before the creation of the world, the Father, Son, and Spirit decided that they would not hoard their life and their fullness and their glory and their goodness, but open the doors and share it with us. Give us a real place within their life. This is not an afterthought. This is not plan B. This is plan A. This is the first thought of God. The universe, our solar system, the earth, and humanity are not eternal. Christian church has always confessed that they were created out of nothing. There was a time when there was no world. There was a time when there was no universe, when there was no earth, and there was no human existence. And humanity had no power and no possibility of being at all. The Christian church sets creation in the context of God's activity. God created for a reason. It tells us, the Bible tells us, that behind the creation of the universe and of everything within it, including every single human being, that behind the creation of the world and behind your existence is that relationship of the Father, Son, and Spirit. Creation is the fruit of purpose. It is the outgrowth of a heart willing and determined to accomplish a definite goal. Behind creation, behind your existence and mine, figuring as the driving force of all divine activity, as the one thought on the forefront of the divine mind and the preoccupation of the heart of God, was the decision to give human beings a place in that circle. Before the blueprints for creation were ever drawn up, the Father, Son, and Spirit named you and determined that you would belong to that circle and be given access to everything that goes on there in that relationship. They decided not to hoard their glory, but to share it, to lavish it. That's Paul's word, to lavish it upon us. You know what lavish means? You know the difference between doing something in a grudging sort of way and then lavishing it? Grudging is when you really don't want to, but you've got to. So you kind of grind it out and just get it done. Lavish is when you think all day long about the blessing. Your whole day is caught up in how you're going to present this gift to the person that you love. You're in a hurry. Nothing can keep you back from it. That's what Paul says. That God planned from eternity to lavish His love, His life, all the glory and fullness that exists between the Father, Son, and Spirit upon us. Now, why this is so, why God is this way, why the Father, Son, and Spirit set the fullness of their love upon us and determined such an almost unbelievable but certainly glorious destiny for us, can only be answered by peering into the mutual love of the Father, Son, and Spirit. For in one way or another, the existence of everything in the universe, and again, not least every single human being, finds its purpose and meaning in that circle and in the love of the Father, Son, and Spirit. That circle of love and intimacy and togetherness and fellowship and camaraderie, that circle of purity and mutual delight and care is the womb and the matrix and the root of all divine thought. You beginning to get that? I challenge you. I think what's going on in your life is that you've got God doing other things. You're not sure about that God. Because you've got another God over here floating around on the other part of your mind. You're not sure about his attitude. That's what's happened to us in the Western world. We lost the Trinity. You lose the Trinity, you get the divine ogre. And you don't know what he's fixing to do. You get that? See how that works? We don't believe in an ogre. We believe in the Father, Son, and Spirit. That's God. There is no other God. That's the only God there is. That's the only God there's ever been and the only God there ever will be. And this God, before the foundation of the world, named us and claimed us and said, I'm going to share all that we have together with you. That's the heart of the Christian message. Now, the thought of sharing with others, the thought of giving, the thought of that self-giving and other-centeredness, the thought of caring, the thought of giving out of yourself is not unnatural for God. It's who God is as the Father, Son, and Spirit. But the question is, why then would God turn this love upon us? To love in this way, with such lavish and excessive philanthropy and goodness, and such determination, is not unnatural for God, because that's the way the Father loves the Son and the Son loves the Father, and the Spirit loves the Father and the Son. But why this God would turn that love upon us is another question. Before such love, before such an act, before such a determined decision, all we can do is stand amazed and thrilled and astonished. Christian faith begins and ends with astonishment. You call yourself a Christian, if you're not astonished, you hadn't seen God, and you hadn't encountered the eternal passion and grace of the Father, Son, and Spirit for you. The only response is one of utter astonishment. And that astonishment won't go away. You won't move up a notch to higher things. All through eternity, we're just going to be going, man, what a deal. You know, that's a good deal. That God is this way and turns his love and passion upon us. Now, the reason I've labored this, and the reason I've painted this part of the picture, is because I want it to be very clear in your mind. That decision to share the love and the life and the fellowship and the freedom and the glory and the fullness and the beauty and the wholeness and the holiness of that life with us, that decision is the true and proper context for understanding the death of Jesus Christ. Because the reason Jesus Christ comes to earth and dies is because God the Father Almighty will not go back on his purpose. He has a dream for us and he will not change. He sends his Son into the far country and says, find my sheep and bring them home, whatever it costs. You see that? Jesus is not bad news, he's good news. He reveals the fact that God the Father Almighty has never forsaken us, never turned his back upon us, and never will. The proof is Jesus. You see that? We've ripped apart the Father and the Son. I'll have more to say on that next Wednesday. I want it to sink into your soul. I know you don't know it. I don't know it. It's a rumor. May be true, may not be true. But it hasn't sunk into our soul that before the foundation of the world, God the Father Almighty loved you and has never changed his mind. As Jesus says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. Before creation, the triune God set their love upon us and decided that we would be included in that circle of fullness and glory. And with that decision made by the Father, Son, and Spirit came a fire in God's belly that it would be so no matter what it cost. You see, what I'm telling you is that the Lamb of God was slain before the foundation of the world in the heart of the Father, Son, and Spirit. They knew full well what it was going to cost when they made that decision. Now, what was God's reaction then to Adam and Eve's sin and the plunge into ruin that we read about in Genesis chapter 3? What did God do when the human race was plunged into ruin and began lapsing back into non-being and nothingness, as Athanasius said? Did God throw up his hands and walk away disgusted? Did he say, I knew it, they'd blow it, they deserve to perish, let them perish? Did God's blood begin to boil with anger at the audacity of human disobedience? Did he breathe fire and threaten vengeance? What was God's response to the fall? What was God's response when his creation began lapsing back into nothingness in the Garden of Eden? Did his blood begin to boil with plans of punishment and retribution? No. The fall of Adam was met by the eternal Word of God. The fall of Adam was met by the same purpose and plan that birthed creation in the first place. The disaster of Adam's sin, the chaos and the misery, the brokenness and the bondage of Adam's rebellion was met with an immediate and stout and intolerable divine no. I did not create you to perish. I didn't create you for nothingness. I didn't create you to flounder in brokenness and destitution and pain and misery. Not you. I created you for life. I created you to share in my life and glory, to share in the fullness and the joy and the glory that I have with my Son in the fellowship of the Holy Spirit, and it will be so. I will have it no other way. That's God's response to the fall, to Adam and Eve's sin. No! You belong to me. Not the nothingness, not darkness, not misery. You see, in John's Gospel, over 40 times we are told not that Jesus came, but that he was sent by the Father. 40-something times John tells us that Jesus was sent by the Father because John saw it. He saw not only creation began in that circle of relationship between the Father, Son, and Spirit. He saw that Jesus Christ comes because the Father's passion for us is unyielding, determined. He will not let his dream for us go. And he sends his Son into the far country to find us all, and bring us home. You see that? You feel that? So when you look at Jesus Christ, you're looking at the passion of God the Father for you and for me and for the whole human race. That's who Jesus is. He's the Father's beloved Son who reveals the Father, who sets the Father's heart right before us. Jesus Christ dies on the cross of Calvary because God the Father Almighty absolutely refuses to allow you to be destroyed, because you are precious in his sight. And he will not abandon you. He will not forsake you. He loves you so much, as John tells us and Jesus tells us, that he sent his only begotten Son. And I will tell you a secret. The Father will be satisfied with nothing less than us being put in that circle. We have turned satisfaction on its head. Missed the point. The Father will never be satisfied until we have been gathered together and brought back to be with him. Now, that sets the one side of the context. You with me? You hanging in there? I don't think we believe in the goodness of God. I've been right across the Western world. I just don't think we get it. We know about the love of God, and we can quote the Bible verses. And I'm talking about it sinking down into the depths of our soul. You believe that that God named you and claimed you from the foundation of the world. Brother and sister, you will be at peace. You will be resting. You will be filled with hope and assurance. A hope and assurance that is not available anywhere else in the world. That's the thing that makes the Christian distinct from the world. Not that we figured out a code of ethics that we can apply and a certain way of dressing to make ourselves look better than others. The thing that distinguishes the Christian church from the world is assurance. It's hope. It's peace. Joy. We keep inventing a religion. It's dead and boring and empty. It's one of those creations in our minds that's a disaster. God's calling us back to know who He is, what He's planned for us, and who we are, and to rest. Show me a man that's resting. I'll show you a great daddy. Because he's there. Emotionally, spiritually, mentally, for his family. That's all God wants. Because that's the life that exists there. Okay. I'm going to come back to that again and again. I'm seeing more clearly now in my own struggles in my own life and in the pastoral discussions that I have with people that that's the deepest problem with all of us. We don't really believe that God the Father is for us. Maybe if we hang with Jesus. You know, a friend of mine back home told me, he said, it's kind of like the bully on the playground. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, there's a bully on the playground, and he doesn't like anybody. But he does like this kid named Jesus. So if you hang with Jesus, the bully will leave you alone. But if Jesus goes to the bathroom, then, you know, you're in a heap of trouble, because then the bully comes forward. Because the bully really doesn't like you. He'll tolerate you if you're hanging in the right circle. He said, that's the way we think about God. The Father doesn't really like us, but somehow Jesus has gotten in there, and if we hang with Him and we plead the blood, you know, we can kind of skirt in heaven behind the coattails of Jesus. Where does that leave your soul? Where does that leave your heart? It doesn't leave you with peace and assurance. It doesn't leave you with hope. Now, I have a suspicion that we're going to revisit that, so I will move on. The second thing that stands for, or stands as the context, that functions as the context for the death of Jesus, is what is called the fall, or sin. So the second thing to be said about the death of Jesus Christ is that the only way to get us from where we are to the right hand of God the Father Almighty is through death. The only way to get us, in the context of sin and the problem of sin, from where we are to the Father's right hand is to take us through death and recreate us in resurrection and lift us back in ascension in that circle. Now, as a child, I was taught the Children's Catechism in the Reformed and Presbyterian tradition. And I remember specifically the day my mother finally got through to me and taught me the definition of sin. She was very serious in trying to get me to learn this, and I was not interested. But I can remember she finally said, sin, it's in the catechism. What is sin? Sin is any one of conformity unto or transgression of the law of God. Sin is not doing what you're supposed to do and then doing what you're not supposed to do. I can remember, it was almost like yesterday, my mother was kind of like, oh, you got it, you finally got it. Spent 42 years trying to get out from under such a shallow and pitiful view of sin. That is a typically legal understanding of sin about breaking a rule. The problem God has on His hands in the fall is not about human beings started breaking rules. The problem is that a disease has set in, a spiritual cancer has set inside of our existence that is not only destroying our existence, but it's destroying our life and our freedom and our fellowship. Sin is a disease. The catechism and the whole legal orientation of the Western world confuses the root with the fruit. From the disease comes all manner of sins and wrongdoings. But changing the sins and wrongdoings never deals with the root problem. Root problem is a spiritual cancer. Root problem is a disease deep inside. And when I was a senior at the University of Mississippi, I found a copy of Athanasius' great book on the incarnation of the Word of God. How many of you have ever heard of that? Every one of you just heard it, so you all heard it. One of my top 5 all-time favorite Christian books. Easy, easy, easy to read, and you are keeping yourself from a blessing by not getting it. Matter of fact, it's on our website, or will be, perrycaresis.org. Beautiful book, written when he was 21 years old, and anybody can understand it, the way theology ought to be written. The day that I found that book, when I was a senior at Ole Miss, I went back and read it in one sitting, and Athanasius taught me 2 things that have stuck with me ever since. The first thing he taught me was exactly what we've been talking about here with the love of the Father. So Athanasius is sitting there and he says, what is God to do? What is God being good to do when His creation is suddenly threatened? When His dreams for us are suddenly threatened and His creation is suddenly lapsing into nothing and is going into extinction, is fixing to disappear and be gone. And Athanasius says, what's God to do? And Athanasius, you can feel it in his heart. He says, it's unthinkable that God would turn a cold shoulder, let alone turn His back on us. So Athanasius sees that the coming of Jesus, the fire in the belly of the Father goes into the Son, and the Son comes into the far country to find us because that's the Father's determined purpose. He won't let us go. Athanasius taught me that. I saw it, gripped my heart sitting there, that the whole thing begins with the Father. He doesn't have to be changed to like us. He doesn't have to be conditioned into being good toward us. He doesn't have to have His arm twisted to love you. He loves you from the foundation of the world. That's why Jesus came. We've got it turned around. And right around the Western world, we're suffering profound mental illness because of that. 1 in 7 Americans suffer from serious depression. That's a bunch of folks. I heard on a plane somewhere over the Pacific, the same statistic cited for Australia. Cited the American study, then cited the Australian studies and said the same statistic holds true. Now I know that there are medical problems there, all sorts of physiological problems, but I guarantee you what is at the core of our problem is that we don't know who God is. And we're scared to death on the inside. And we have got to get the truth in there and let it go to work, bringing healing. Every one of us. Everyone in this room and everyone you'll ever meet, I know that God the Father loves you, and I know you don't know that. I know that about myself, and I know it about my children. That's the battleground. And that's got to sink down into the soul and bring some real healing. We'll have more to say on that in the last lecture. Now, where was I? Talking about the fall. Athanasius was the first one that taught me that the whole event of the coming of Jesus begins with the heart of the Father and His refusal to allow us to perish. The sin of Adam. The sin of Adam was met by the same divine determination to bless that birthed the creation in the first place. You see how that works? The sin of Adam was met by the same divine determination to bless that called forth creation in the first place. Now, the second thing I learned from Athanasius is that sin is an organic problem. It's a disease. The problem that God has on His hands in the fall is not a legal problem. It is an organic problem. Sin is a spiritual cancer that destroys our humanity and our existence. And therefore, God's forgiveness is not just about saying, I forgive you. God's forgiveness is about healing. As T.F. Torrance says, Professor T.F. Torrance in Scotland says, forgiveness is about God's forgiveness being done into our human existence so that what issues forth is real reconciliation. Not just a ledger being balanced. You can balance a ledger all day long. It doesn't change the disease. It doesn't bring a healing where the problem is. Forgiveness is something that God is going to do into human flesh and blood existence. Powerfully pictured for us in the whole event of circumcision in the Old Covenant. It's going to be cut into existence. Forgiveness is going to be cut into flesh and blood existence in real reconciliation. Now, after I read Athanasius' book, not long after that, I was asked to teach a Bible study for some students at college. It was the very first Bible study I ever taught. I remember walking around my apartment trying to think of a way of communicating the problem of sin. I wanted to talk about Jesus and who Jesus is and what he did. And so I wanted to talk about sin, and I was really struggling with coming up with a concept that they could see and understand and relate to. I was thinking along Athanasius' lines that it's a disease and a cancer, but I thought, how do you talk about that? And being a bachelor in those days, I was walking around my apartment and noticed a bowl of oranges on the cabinet that had been there for a lot longer than my wife would have let them stay there, I can tell you that. But I'll say this much, they were hardly orange anymore. Kind of black and moldy and crusty and imploding and gishy and diseased, and they felt like spaghetti noodles wrapped in, what do you call it, Bruce? Glad wrap. We call it cling film, or, you know, you get the, it was really gross. I took that orange to the Bible study. I held it up and I said, that's the problem of sin right there. It's not a legal problem. It's a disease. It's a core problem. And if God is going to get us in this situation to the right hand of God the Father so that we can enjoy and live in that life, then the disease has to be healed. You see that? The disease, the cancer has to be excised out of our humanity. That is the dilemma that the love of the Father, Son, and Spirit faced in the fall of Adam. How are they going to heal the disease that has infiltrated human existence? How are they going to bring a cure to that without losing us in the process? You think about it, sometimes the surgery is so radical the patient dies. Defeats the purpose. So how is God going to bring healing to that kind of profound disorder in us without losing us? That's the problem that God faces in the fall. Now, the analogy of the diseased orange is good as far as it goes, but it's limited. It helps us to get a little bit of a picture of how we're not dealing with a legal problem, but an organic problem. But it's still very vague and imprecise. I mean, what does it mean to speak of the alienation of our beings? What exactly does that mean? What does it mean to speak of a spiritual disease? How do we understand that? Now, if we're going to go forward, we've got to move from a disease and think a little bit more psychologically. We've got to open a window, as it were, and peer down into Adam and Eve's soul and begin to look inside the soul, and then we're going to begin to understand the problem of alienation and the problem of the disease. Y'all with me? Wait. Hanging in there? Good. Now, to be alive, to breathe, to exist is one thing, but it's quite another to be filled with overflowing and abounding life. You see that? To exist is one thing, but to be filled with overflowing and abounding life is another. Adam and Eve were both alive and filled. This is very important. Adam and Eve were both alive, they existed, and they were filled with overflowing and abounding life. Now, the freedom of Adam and Eve to love and the freedom of Adam and Eve to be loved the freedom of Adam and Eve to know and to be known, the freedom to expose themselves, the freedom to love and be loved, and the freedom for fellowship is not something that resided in Adam and Eve's heart. As my friend Kerry Stockett back home says, that freedom was not something that was built in at the factory. The freedom to love, Adam's freedom to love Eve, Adam's freedom to think about her more than himself, his freedom to know and be known, his freedom to go out of himself and embrace Eve and to give to her was not a freedom that he possessed in himself. That was a freedom that belongs properly to that circle and that circle alone. That's God's freedom. So the question is, how did God's freedom to love, God's freedom to give, God's freedom to be more preoccupied with others than with himself, how did that freedom get from God as Father, Son, and Spirit into Adam and Eve? I mean, did they just get sort of zapped? They got it? And how does that work? This is a very critical question, it seems to me. How does the freedom of God, the Father, and Son, and Spirit for fellowship get inside of Adam and Eve? Now, the answer to that question, it seems to me, to borrow a statement from Jesus, is that Adam and Eve knew the truth. They knew the truth, and the truth set them free. Now let me try to explain this just a little bit to get a handle on it. Adam and Eve participated in the freedom of God, the Father, Son, and Spirit, to care for one another, to love. And they participated in that by knowing the truth, and the truth set them free to experience God's freedom. And in living out that freedom for one another, they experienced fellowship. And fellowship is the thing that translates existence into abounding life. You see the difference? Fellowship is the thing that translates mere existence into abounding and overflowing life. Adam and Eve belonged to God. They were the prized creation, the pearl of great price in God's eye, the apple of God's eye. They were the objects of God's personal delight and love, and certainly breathtaking blessing. Knowing who they were, knowing that they belonged to God, knowing that He delighted in them, did not fill Adam and Eve's soul with fear. Knowing that the Father delighted in them did not fill their soul with anxiety. It filled their soul with what? Peace. Real simple but deep peace. Security. It bathed their souls with security. Knowing God the Father delighted in them, baptized Adam and Eve's soul with the most powerful force on earth. Assurance. Assurance. That assurance, that baptism of assurance in turn did what? Set them free to be concerned for one another. Set them free to notice. Knowing the truth, baptize their soul with assurance. Assurance set them free to know and be known, free to care, free to go out of themselves and give themselves. You know, you can't give yourself to another person unless you know you're going to be okay. You can't do it. If you're afraid for yourself, then you're taking. You're not giving. Knowing the truth, baptized Adam and Eve's soul with assurance. That assurance stirred freedom into being. Freedom to love, to know and be known, to care, to reach out and to give, to be other-centered. And what did that freedom do? Created fellowship. What I call in my new book, The Great Dance. See how that works? Knowing the truth produces assurance. Assurance produces freedom. Freedom allows you to walk out and gives you the ability to love someone. And in loving them, you have fellowship. And that fellowship is the fellowship of the Father, Son, and Spirit. And that's how it works. Adam and Eve had that. They were the prized creations. They were baptized with assurance. Now, Let's turn that picture on its head. How are we doing on time, guys? Bad? Okay. My watch is still set on American time. We got another 30 hours. All right, let me paint one little picture and I'll stop here. Think about what happens when a 5-year-old little girl believes there is a monster in the closet. Think about what happens to her insides when she believes in the monster. For her to believe in the reality of that monster is to have a razor slice through her soul. And instead of the baptism of assurance, she's being baptized with what? Fear, anxiety, angst. She believes in the monster. That belief baptizes her soul in fear and anxiety. And what does that baptism of anxiety do to her? She's like this. She can't even get out of the bed. She can't go outside. She's lost her freedom to go, to move forward, to step out. Lost her freedom to do anything, to engage her world. You see how that works? That's what happened to Adam and Eve. A baptism of anxiety, very much like that, happened in Adam and Eve because they stopped believing in the goodness of God and believed in the lie of the evil one. And when they did that, when they believed that God was holding out on them, that God did not really love them enough to give them quite everything that they should have, when they believed they were really not yet in the real glory, a razor cut through their soul. You see how that works? Anxiety began percolating, baptized their soul with fear and anxiety. It infiltrated the scene of human existence, and nothing has been the same since. Now that's point 2 on the fall. We need to take a break here. 3 minutes. Let's just walk this through on a practical level so that you can see it, because we're still talking about the same thing in our lives. The same thing's happening to us when we come over here on the other side and we're trying to figure out how to live the Christian life. The evil one doesn't have too many tricks. He's doing the same thing to us again that he did to Adam and Eve. He's trying to get us to doubt the heart of God the Father, which produces what? Here. Fear and anxiety. It produces a lethal rue. R-O-U-X. You know what that word means? Got some cooks in here? A couple of cooks? Roux is a French cooking term, also used in my part of the world in Cajun cooking. You begin with a little oil, a little butter, whatever, some celery and onions, garlic, and you put a little oil and you start, and you make your basic, roux is what we call it. And that flavor there is going to permeate the entire dish. Whatever you put in there is going to be permeated with that. And that's what happened in Adam and Eve. The evil one came to them and said, and you look at the text, basically what he's doing is saying, God's holding out on you. You don't have everything you're supposed to have. Getting them to doubt the heart of God, getting them to believe that they're not yet what they're supposed to be. They believed it, just like that little girl believes there's a monster in the closet. It creates a lethal roux. You know what lethal means? Death. Deadly. A deadly roux, because it creates anxiety, rejection, guilt, fear, and all of that begins to bubble up. And it begins to come forward out into our lives. We don't even know what's going on. Jesus said, the one who comes to him, out of his innermost being would flow what? Rivers of what? Rivers of living water. Out of his innermost being will flow rivers of anxiety. Out of his innermost being will flow rivers of fear. Out of his innermost being will flow rivers of angst and guilt and shame and loss. No, he says, out of your innermost being will flow rivers of living water. That's his picture. What he's saying is when you come to know Jesus, all this in the inside begins to be healed. And then what proceeds forth out of you, I'm not talking about what you say, I'm not talking about words or actions, but when it begins to proceed forth out of you invisibly and reaching out to people is a river of living water. It's hope, assurance, peace. Other people experience that as a drink of cool water. It's life, quickening. And what happened in Adam and Eve was they believed the lie, and it began to go to work and create that anxiety and fear within their soul. It shut down Adam's freedom to be there for Eve and Eve's freedom to be there for Adam. It shut down their freedom for fellowship. So instead of having fellowship, they had brokenness. And instead of having the great dance, what'd they have? The first family feud. You see how that works? Sin is a disease, and it is the loss of freedom to love. Because when you're afraid, you're self-centered. When you're self-centered, you're not capable of caring for another person. When I was first married, my wife and I had occasional spat. But in one of them, I remember she just more or less nailed me, and she told me that I was self-centered. And I said, yes, I know that, but I don't know how not to be. You can't be free from being self-centered when you're afraid for yourself. Only knowing that we belong to God begins to produce the freedom to be centered not upon ourselves, but upon others. The value of this one little point for marriages is almost beyond our imaginations. Okay, we'll stop there.